$436. That's what I had to pay when Brenda Harwick had my truck towed while I was grocery shopping. I came home to tire tracks, and this woman standing there with the smuggest grin I've ever seen. My Honda Ridgeline was gone, dragged away because it was supposedly an eyesore. Then she did something that crossed every line. She picked up my veteran parking permit, threw it in the trash, and sneered, "Military people think they're special, but this is my neighborhood now. 23 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, and this woman treats me like garbage on my own property." Well, if Brenda could block my driveway with a tow truck, I figured I could block her entire street with something that weighs 30 tons. What's the worst thing an HOA's done to you? Where are you watching from? Because sometimes bullies need to learn that veterans don't back down. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and 6 months ago I thought I'd found the perfect place to spend my retirement. Willowbrook Heights, a quiet development about 30 minutes outside Denver where the lawns stay green year-round and the mailboxes all match. After 23 years bouncing between Army bases from Fort Bragg to Afghanistan, my wife Carmen and I were ready for some peace and quiet. Carmen's a nurse at the VA hospital, works long shifts patching up guys like me who came back with more scars than stories. Our daughter Sophia just turned 16, and after years of military housing, she was excited about having her own room that wasn't government-issued beige. We bought a modest 3-bedroom ranch on Maple Street. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. The smell of fresh mulch and newly planted roses hit you the moment you stepped out of the car. Carmen had already started planting her herb garden, and I could picture myself on the front porch every morning with my coffee, listening to those mockingbirds singing in the old oak tree that shaded our driveway. That's where I met Brenda Harwick. Picture a woman who looks like she stepped out of a real estate magazine. Blonde highlights that could blind aircraft, designer yoga pants that probably cost more than my truck payment, and a voice that could shatter wine glasses from 3 blocks away. She lived in the corner house, the biggest one in the development, complete with a circular driveway and more outdoor lighting than a football stadium. Brenda wasn't just any neighbor. She was the HOA president, and she made damn sure everyone knew it. She'd cruise the neighborhood in her white Lexus SUV like she was patrolling her personal kingdom, clipboard in hand, looking for violations. The first warning came on a Tuesday morning while I was loading my Honda Ridgeline for a trip to Home Depot. Clean, well-maintained, parked in my own driveway like it had been for 3 weeks straight. "Excuse me," came that voice, dripping with fake sweetness. "I'm Brenda Harwick, HOA president. We need to discuss your commercial vehicle situation." Her handshake was limp, like touching a cold fish, but it was her perfume that really got me. This overpowering lavender scent that made you want to hold your breath. Commercial vehicle? I looked back at my truck, genuinely confused. "Ma'am, that's my personal. Section 4.7 of your agreement is very clear. Commercial vehicles lower property values." She was already walking away. "You have 48 hours to resolve this." Here's what really pissed me off. Carl Henderson lived 3 houses down, drove an identical white F-150, and had been parking it in his driveway since the development opened. Never got so much as a warning. The difference? Carl was white and his truck was white. Mine was dark blue, and apparently so was I in Brenda's eyes. That Thursday morning, I woke up to the sound of diesel engines and backup beepers. Through my bedroom window, I watched a tow truck driver hooking chains to my Ridgeline while Brenda stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, supervising like a general watching a battle. The crunch of gravel under the tow truck's tires was nothing compared to the sound of my blood pressure spiking. I threw on clothes and ran outside. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" The driver, a tired-looking guy in coveralls, shrugged apologetically. "Sorry, buddy. Got a work order for commercial vehicle removal. Lady says it's been warned twice." "Twice?" I turned to Brenda. "You gave me 1 warning yesterday." That's when she smiled. Actually smiled. "The first warning was implied when you moved into our community, Mr. Rodriguez. Surely someone with your background understands the importance of following orders." $436. That's what it cost me to get my truck back from the impound lot. $436 because this power-hungry suburbanite decided my Honda Ridgeline was somehow different from Carl's identical Ford. But as I signed that impound release, something clicked in my mind. 23 years in the Army Corps of Engineers teaches you one thing above all else. When someone declares war on you, you'd better be prepared to win it. The next week, I did my homework like any good soldier. I spread those HOA documents across my kitchen table and went through them with military precision, the smell of Carmen's morning coffee mixing with the musty scent of legal paperwork. Section 4.7 was crystal clear. No commercial vehicles primarily used for business purposes shall be parked on any residential property or street within the community. Keywords: primarily used for business purposes. My Honda Ridgeline had personal registration, personal insurance, no business markings, and was used for exactly the same things as every other pickup in the neighborhood: Home Depot runs, family trips, and hauling Sophia's friends to soccer practice. I documented everything with the same attention to detail I'd used for military reports. Photos of my truck's registration, screenshots of my insurance policy, pictures of Carl Henderson's identical F-150 sitting pretty in his driveway, untouched by HOA justice. The pattern was starting to look a lot like discrimination, and I had the evidence to prove it. Monday morning, I hand-delivered a formal response letter to Brenda's mailbox. Professional, respectful, and backed by legal precedent I'd researched at the VA hospital's law library during Carmen's late shifts. I cited the exact covenant language, included supporting documentation, and politely requested all HOA inspection records under Colorado's sunshine laws. Her response came Tuesday afternoon, that overpowering lavender perfume announcing its arrival before I even opened the envelope. "Mr. Rodriguez," it began, "your recent correspondence demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of community standards and proper authority channels. The HOA board has voted to implement enhanced vehicle monitoring for your property due to ongoing compliance issues." Enhanced monitoring, like I was some kind of repeat offender planning a vehicular crime spree. The monitoring started immediately. Every morning at exactly 8:15 a.m., Brenda would cruise past my house in her white Lexus, slowing to a crawl while she photographed my truck from every angle. She had this little digital camera with a timestamp feature, and she treated my driveway like a crime scene investigation. I watched her one morning from my kitchen window, coffee growing cold in my hand, as she actually got out of her car with a measuring tape. This 52-year-old real estate agent, dressed in designer workout clothes, army crawling under my Honda Ridgeline to photograph the VIN number like she was documenting evidence for a federal case. The sight of a grown woman in $200 yoga pants wriggling around in driveway gravel while Mrs. Cecilia's orange tabby rubbed against her legs was, well, it was comedy gold that I definitely wasn't recording for evidence purposes. But Brenda's surveillance operation had one major flaw. She was playing amateur detective against a guy who'd spent 2 decades in actual hostile territory. I know a thing or two about counterintelligence. I installed a discrete security camera system that Thursday, nothing fancy, just enough to document the daily Brenda show. Within a week, I had hours of footage showing her measuring my truck, photographing my license plate, and conducting what could only be described as vehicular reconnaissance missions. Then came the twist I wasn't expecting. Friday morning brought the second towing notice, this time claiming my truck was parked improperly in violation of community aesthetic standards. The truck was parked exactly where it had been every day for a month, centered in my driveway, 2 feet from the garage door, perfectly parallel to the house. But here's where Brenda made her first real mistake. She used a different towing company. When I called to complain, the dispatcher was refreshingly honest. "Yeah, we got a call about an abandoned vehicle," he said, his voice carrying that tired tone of someone who'd seen this game before. "Lady claimed it hadn't moved in over 2 weeks, but our driver said the engine was still warm when he got there, and there were fresh tire tracks in the driveway. Seemed fishy, but we had a valid work order." Abandoned vehicle, my truck that I drove to the grocery store literally every other day. The fees had mysteriously increased to $425 plus daily storage. When I asked why, the impound clerk just shrugged. "HOA complaints get priority pricing. Your association pays extra for immediate response." My association. Using my HOA dues to pay premium rates for harassing me. That night, I made a phone call to Jake Morrison, an old Army buddy who'd traded his combat boots for a law degree. Jake had mentioned once during a deployment that he specialized in something called pattern discrimination, the kind of systematic harassment that courtrooms take very seriously. "Marcus," he said after I explained the situation, his lawyer voice kicking in, "what you're describing isn't just petty HOA bullshit. This is targeted enforcement with clear racial overtones. In cases like this, individual board members can actually be held personally liable beyond the association's insurance coverage. Document everything, and I mean everything. Patterns matter more than individual incidents in discrimination law. The next morning, I filed a formal records request with the city asking for all HOA enforcement actions in Willowbrook Heights over the past 2 years. What came back 3 weeks later was pure prosecutorial gold. 23 vehicle violations issued to homeowners, 22 of them to non-white residents, and 1 to a white homeowner that was resolved with a warning letter: no towing, no fees. Brenda had just handed me a smoking gun, wrapped in a bow made of systematic discrimination and tied with her own signature lavender-scented stupidity. Armed with a smoking gun disguised as public records, I figured Brenda might back down. Shows what I know about dealing with entitled suburbanites who mistake a clipboard for actual authority. Instead, she doubled down like a gambler with house money. The emergency HOA board meeting notice appeared in everyone's mailbox on a Wednesday, printed on official letterhead that probably cost more per sheet than most people's lunch. Urgent. Enhanced Community Standards Amendment. Mandatory attendance requested. I showed up that Thursday evening to find the community center packed tighter than a mess hall during chow time. The air conditioning was struggling against the body heat, and you could smell everything from expensive cologne to nervous sweat mixing in the recycled air like some twisted aromatherapy session. Brenda had prepared like she was addressing the UN Security Council. She stood at the front podium in a crisp white blazer, armed with a PowerPoint presentation titled "Preserving Property Values Through Proactive Vehicle Management." The woman had actually laminated her notes. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying that fake authority that comes from watching too many courtroom dramas. "We're facing an unprecedented threat to our community standards. Certain residents have been flagrantly violating our vehicle covenants, and immediate action is required." Her slideshow was a masterpiece of petty bureaucracy. Photos of pickup trucks from Google Images labeled as community standard violations. Statistics about property values that she'd apparently pulled from her perfectly manicured posterior. And my personal favorite, a slide titled "Commercial Vehicle Red Flags," that basically described every pickup truck manufactured since Henry Ford's first assembly line. I sat in the back recording everything on my phone while taking notes like I was planning a military operation, which, let's be honest, I was. "The board proposes enhanced vehicle standards," Brenda continued, clicking to a slide that made my blood pressure spike. "Effective immediately. No pickup trucks, no vehicles over 10 years old, no vehicles with visible wear or commercial associations. Retroactive enforcement will be implemented for existing violations." During the comment period, I stood up with my folder of documentation, the papers rustling like autumn leaves in the suddenly quiet room. "Mrs. Harwick, I have a question about enforcement statistics." Her smile could have frozen hell in July. "Of course, Mr. Rodriguez. Can you explain why Carl Henderson's white F-150 has never been cited while my identical truck has been towed twice?" I pulled out my photos. Both trucks, same year, same model, both parked in driveways. What's the fundamental difference? The room went silent except for the hum of struggling fluorescent lights and someone's nervous cough echoing off the walls. Brenda's face flushed red beneath her foundation like a thermometer hitting fever levels. "Mr. Henderson's vehicle doesn't present the same aesthetic concerns," she stammered. "What aesthetic concerns specifically? They're mechanically and visually identical trucks." That's when board member Janet Walsh, a retired teacher who'd been suspiciously quiet, spoke up with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years managing teenagers. "Brenda, I've driven past both properties multiple times. Marcus is absolutely right. Those trucks are essentially twins." Another board member, Tom Bradley, shifted uncomfortably in his seat like he was sitting on thumbtacks. "Are we completely sure about these enforcement statistics? Because if there's a documented pattern..." I could see Brenda losing control of her carefully orchestrated meeting faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Time to twist the knife. "I've filed a formal records request with the city," I announced, my voice carrying across the packed room like a drill sergeant's morning reveille. 23 vehicle violations in 2 years. 22 against non-white homeowners, 1 against a white homeowner, resolved with a warning letter only. I let that mathematical reality sink in. That's not enforcement. That's systematic discrimination. The murmur that rippled through the crowd sounded like distant thunder before a storm. People were pulling out their phones, probably doing their own calculations on Brenda's enforcement record. But Brenda wasn't done. In fact, she was just getting warmed up for what I'd later realize was the most spectacular self-destruction in suburban HOA history. Mr. Rodriguez clearly doesn't understand that some vehicles simply don't fit our community character, she said, her voice getting shriller with each word. We have standards here. We have a certain demographic we're trying to maintain. The room went dead quiet. Someone actually gasped audibly. Janet Walsh looked like she'd been physically slapped. Brenda, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that we invested in this community for a very specific reason, Brenda snapped, completely abandoning any pretense of diplomatic language. We didn't pay premium prices to live next to people who don't respect property values or understand community standards. And there it was, on recording, in front of 47 witnesses. Tom Bradley immediately called for an emergency vote of no confidence. Janet Walsh seconded so fast she nearly interrupted him. Even Brenda's usual allies were suddenly fascinated by their shoes like they'd discovered buried treasure in the floor tiles. The vote was 4-1 against implementing the new vehicle restrictions, with only Brenda voting in favor. The no-confidence motion failed by a single vote, but the damage was radioactive. Walking back to my truck that night, listening to gravel crunch under my boots, I couldn't help but grin. In the military, we had a saying, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. Brenda had just made a career-ending mistake, recorded it for posterity, and gift-wrapped it with a racist bow. Now I just had to decide exactly how to use this ammunition. You'd think recording someone admitting to racial bias in front of half the neighborhood would slow them down. You'd be wrong. Apparently, when you corner a suburban dictator, they don't retreat. They evolve into something more dangerous. Brenda's next move hit social media like a digital wildfire. It started on Nextdoor with anonymous posts from concerned residents about declining neighborhood standards and certain new residents who don't understand community values. The language was coded, but the message was neon bright. Screenshots started flowing into my phone from neighbors who recognized Brenda's signature style, unnecessary capitalization and exclamation points that made her posts read like manifesto drafts. Does anyone else feel like our beautiful community is being invaded by people who don't share our values? One post screamed. Some of us didn't pay premium prices to live next to those people who park their eyesore vehicles wherever they want. Carmen discovered the Facebook community group posts while researching preschools, the smell of her stress-baking cinnamon cookies filling the kitchen as she compiled screenshots. Honey, you need to see this racist dumpster fire, she called, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant someone was about to catch holy hell. The posts were a masterclass in suburban dog whistle racism. Recent demographic changes and cultural incompatibility and property value protection, all accompanied by blurry photos that might have been my truck if you squinted hard and possessed a vivid imagination for persecution. But here's where Brenda made her second catastrophic mistake. She got sloppy. One post, apparently written during a wine-fueled rage session at 11 p.m., was posted under her real name instead of her anonymous account. I'm sick of pretending that all residents are equal when some clearly don't belong in a community like ours. The Hispanic family with the truck, the Indian family with their weird decorations, that black nurse who thinks she can park wherever. We all know what the problem is. The post stayed up for exactly 14 minutes before she deleted it. But in the age of smartphones and screenshot reflexes, 14 minutes might as well be 14 years. My phone exploded with notifications, neighbors forwarding the screenshot, local news reporters who'd been tipped off, and one call that made my blood run cold, Sophia crying because her classmates had seen the post and were asking if we were the truck family Brenda was talking about. That's when the gloves came off. Saturday morning, my doorbell rang to reveal what looked like a civil rights convention on my front porch. The Johnsons from Elm Street, the Patel family from Oakwood Drive, Maria Santos from the townhouses, and 6 other families I'd never met, all holding printouts of Brenda's posts, all looking like they'd collectively reached their breaking point. We need to talk, said David Johnson, a software engineer whose crime was driving a 10-year-old Civic with excessive wear patterns. In my backyard, under the shade of that faithful oak tree, the conversation revealed the true scope of Brenda's reign of terror. The Patels had been fined for non-conforming cultural decorations during Diwali. Maria faced monthly harassment about her nephew's Camaro. The Cecilia family had been cited for inappropriate food odors from their weekend barbecues. She's not just targeting vehicles, Maria said, still in her nurse scrubs after a 12-hour shift. She's targeting anyone who reminds her that America doesn't look like her country club. That's when I dropped the bombshell that changed everything. She just handed us a federal case, I announced, pulling out my phone to show them the screenshot of her deleted post. That rant she posted? It's not just racism, it's documented housing discrimination under federal law. The silence was deafening except for Mrs. Cecilia's sharp intake of breath. I called Jake Morrison on speaker, his lawyer voice immediately shifting into high gear when I read him Brenda's post verbatim. "Jesus Christ, Marcus," he said, his professional composure cracking. "She just admitted to systematic racial targeting in writing. This isn't an HOA dispute anymore. This is a federal civil rights violation, the kind that triggers FBI investigations and criminal charges." Jake explained something I hadn't fully grasped. When housing discrimination becomes systematic and documented, it voids HOA insurance coverage and exposes board members to personal criminal liability. Federal prosecutors love cases with this much evidence. "How long before she realizes what she's done?" I asked. "Based on her pattern of escalation? She won't realize until the federal marshals knock on her door. People like this always think they're untouchable right up until they're not." That evening, grilling burgers while Sophia played guitar and Carmen planned our legal strategy at the patio table, I felt that familiar pre-mission calm. The sweet smell of barbecue smoke mixed with evening jasmine as I started planning something Brenda would never see coming. She thought she was fighting some immigrant veteran who didn't know his rights. What she'd actually done was hand a combat engineer enough ammunition to level her entire world. And I was just getting started. 3 weeks into building my federal case, I was drowning in paperwork at the county clerk's office when I found something that made me drop my coffee cup so hard it cracked against the linoleum floor. Buried in page 47 of the original Willowbrook Heights development agreement, hidden in legal language drier than Arizona summer, was a clause that made my hands shake. Developer agrees to maintain 15% affordable housing units in perpetuity to comply with HUD financing requirements. The musty smell of old documents and spilled coffee filled my nostrils as I read the line again and again. 15% affordable housing. In a development of 200 homes, that meant 30 units had to remain designated for working families, veterans, and moderate-income residents. I looked around the cramped clerk's office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps, and realized I might have just found a nuclear weapon disguised as bureaucratic paperwork. Current affordable housing units in Willowbrook Heights, 0, not 1. Not a single goddamn unit. My hands were actually trembling as I photocopied the documents, the machine's bright flash illuminating what amounted to a $2.8 million federal fraud scheme that had been running for 8 years. Back home, I spread the papers across my kitchen table like evidence from a crime scene. The math was beautiful in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. The federal government had provided HUD financing specifically for affordable housing that simply didn't exist. But here's where my blood turned to ice water. My house, according to the original federal filing, was Lot 47, designated as Affordable Housing Unit Number 12. I called Jake Morrison, my voice barely steady. "Jake, I need you to sit down." "I'm already sitting. What did you find?" "This entire development is built on federal fraud. They took $2.8 million in HUD money for affordable housing and then systematically excluded every qualified resident through HOA harassment." The silence on the other end lasted so long I checked if the call had dropped. "Marcus," Jake's voice came back in a whisper, "are you telling me Brenda has been trying to illegally evict you from your own federally designated affordable housing unit?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And here's the beautiful part. Her real estate company handled the original sales. She's known about this requirement for 8 fucking years." Jake's sharp intake of breath cut through the phone line. "Jesus Christ. That's not discrimination anymore. That's organized federal fraud, wire fraud, HUD violations, conspiracy charges that carry 20-year federal sentences." Over the next hour, Jake painted the legal picture in terms that made my combat engineer brain sing with tactical possibilities. When developers accept federal affordable housing money and then systematically exclude those residents, it becomes a federal RICO case. When HOA boards knowingly participate through discriminatory enforcement, they become criminal co-conspirators. "The beauty of this discovery," Jake explained, his lawyer voice barely containing his excitement, "is that your VA loan qualified you for the original affordable housing program. Brenda wasn't just harassing some random veteran, she was committing federal crimes to remove a legally protected resident from his designated unit." The financial destruction would be complete. HUD could demand immediate repayment of $2.8 million plus penalties reaching $15 million. The HOA's insurance wouldn't cover federal fraud, leaving individual homeowners personally liable for the full amount. "How long before federal agents knock on her door?" I asked, watching evening shadows stretch across my legally protected driveway. HUD investigations are thorough and merciless. Once they start auditing, they reconstruct every transaction, every bank record, every conversation for the past decade. That night, sitting on my front porch listening to the suburban symphony of sprinklers and settling houses, the irony was almost poetic. Brenda had spent months trying to force out a guy who was literally supposed to be here under federal law. If she'd just left me alone, I never would have dug deep enough to uncover her decade-long federal crime spree. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply handing your enemies the rope they've been braiding for themselves. With federal fraud charges hanging over Brenda's head like a guillotine, most people would start planning their legal strategy. But I wasn't most people. I was a combat engineer who just discovered that while federal justice was inevitable, it was also slow. And sometimes when you're dealing with a neighborhood tyrant, you need something more immediate. That evening, I called an emergency meeting of what Maria Santos had started calling our Willowbrook Liberation Front, the 11 families Brenda had systematically targeted over the past 3 years. We gathered in my backyard under the old oak tree, the smell of Carmen's fresh coffee mixing with evening jasmine as I spread out my discovery like battle plans. The federal fraud evidence lay in neat stacks while David Johnson pulled up property law databases on his laptop. "Here's what we've got," I announced, watching faces change as I explained the affordable housing fraud. Brenda's company stole $2.8 million in federal funds and has been systematically removing legally protected residents for 8 years. The silence was broken only by Mrs. Patel's sharp intake of breath and the distant sound of sprinklers activating across the neighborhood. "So we sue her into bankruptcy," said Maria, still in scrubs from another long shift. "Federal fraud charges, civil rights violations, the whole package." "We will," I nodded. "But federal cases take 18 to 24 months. That's 2 more years of her harassment while we wait for justice." That's when I remembered something Jake Morrison had mentioned during our last call. His cousin who ran a military surplus operation outside Colorado Springs. "What if we could solve this problem faster?" I asked, pulling out my phone to show them photos from Tank Morrison's website. "What if we could make Brenda understand that some fights aren't worth picking?" The next day, 5 of us made the drive to Jake's Surplus and More, which sat on 40 acres of controlled military chaos. Decommissioned Humvees, artillery shells converted into planters, and enough olive drab paint to camouflage a small city. The smell of diesel fuel and gun oil hung in the mountain air like nostalgic cologne for anyone who'd worn the uniform. "Marcus Rodriguez!" boomed Tommy, Tank Morrison, emerging from behind a stack of ammunition crates like Santa Claus had enlisted in the Marines. "Jake told me about your HOA situation. Said you might need some educational equipment." When Tommy pulled back the massive tarp covering Bertha, our little group fell silent. 30 tons of 1943 Sherman tanks sat there like a sleeping dragon, olive drab paint immaculate, white star gleaming in the Colorado sunlight. "She's completely legal for private ownership," Tommy explained, his pride evident as he patted the tank's hull. "State considers her a recreational vehicle. Fully operational except for the main gun, obviously." David Johnson, our resident research expert, had done his homework on Colorado vehicle laws during the drive up. Private military vehicles are legal as long as they're demilitarized and meet basic safety requirements, he confirmed, pulling up statutes on his phone. Basically a really heavy RV. The beauty of the plan crystallized as Tommy explained the logistics. A standard oversized vehicle permit cost $50 and allowed 72 hours of transport time. Once Bertha reached private property, she could legally park there indefinitely. Now, hypothetically speaking, Tommy grinned, if someone wanted to demonstrate the difference between a legally parked vehicle and actual obstruction, this baby would certainly make the point clear. Mrs. Patel, who'd been quietly studying the tank's specifications, asked the question that made everyone smile. "How long would it take a tow truck to move something like this?" "Ma'am," Tommy's laugh echoed across the yard, There isn't a tow truck in Colorado rated for 30 tons. They'd need specialized heavy equipment that costs more per hour than most people make in a week. The rental agreement was straightforward. 7 days for $20,400, including delivery and pickup. Our group had already agreed to split costs, and the community fundraising through our Neighborhood Justice Fund had reached $3,200 in donations from fed-up residents. As we finalized details, Tommy shared one crucial piece of tactical advice from his own military days. The key to winning any engagement is choosing when and where to fight. Make them come to you, on your terms, with your advantages. The timeline came together perfectly. Federal investigators would need 30 days to process our complaint before launching their audit. That gave us a month-long window where Brenda would be vulnerable but not yet fully aware of her legal jeopardy. Bertha would arrive on a Thursday morning, positioned precisely on my property line where she'd block the main entrance to Brenda's cul-de-sac. Completely legal, absolutely immovable, and utterly impossible to ignore. Driving home through the Colorado foothills, watching sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, I felt that familiar pre-mission calm. Federal justice would handle the long-term destruction, but sometimes a neighborhood needs immediate education about respecting property rights. Brenda thought she was playing chess with immigrants and minorities who didn't understand American law. She was about to learn that some of us understood it better than she did, with significantly more firepower to back up our legal arguments. News travels fast in suburban neighborhoods, especially when it involves federal investigations and tank rentals. What I didn't expect was how quickly Brenda would unravel once she realized the scope of her legal jeopardy. The first sign came Monday morning when I spotted her car parked outside the county clerk's office during my morning run. By the time I circled back, she was storming out of the building, clutching a stack of papers and looking like someone had just explained quantum physics using interpretive dance. She'd found the federal fraud evidence. All of it. Tuesday brought the emergency HOA board meeting notice, hand-delivered by a nervous teenager who apologized 3 times before escaping on his bicycle. Urgent. Legal compliance review, mandatory executive session. I wasn't invited, but David Johnson was, as the board's newest member, elected during the last revolt against Brenda's vehicle harassment. His text updates throughout the meeting read like a real-time nervous breakdown. She's demanding we fire our lawyer to stop cooperating with federal investigators. Tom Bradley just told her that's obstruction of justice. She's screaming about property values and those people destroying everything we built. Janet Walsh is taking minutes. This is going to be evidence. The meeting ended with Brenda being voted out as president by a 4-1 margin, effective immediately. Her response, according to David, was to grab the HOA's corporate checkbook and storm out, claiming she was taking this to higher authorities who understand community standards. By Wednesday, I discovered what higher authorities meant when Channel 7 News called asking for comment on Brenda's media blitz. She'd been calling every local news station, radio show, and newspaper, claiming a dangerous military veteran was threatening the neighborhood with combat equipment. The interviews were pure suburban hysteria. Brenda, positioned in front of her perfectly manicured lawn, explaining to bewildered reporters that certain residents were planning to militarize our peaceful community with weapons of war. When pressed for details, her explanation devolved into coded racism sprinkled with second-hand military jargon. These people don't understand American values. They bring their foreign ways and their combat mentality into our neighborhoods. The reporters' faces during these interviews suggested they were witnessing something between a mental health crisis and a sociological experiment gone wrong. But Brenda's media campaign had an unintended consequence. It attracted attention from people who actually understood military equipment and veteran rights. Thursday morning, my doorbell rang to reveal a man in his 70s wearing a Vietnam Veterans Association cap and a grin that suggested he'd been waiting his whole retirement for this moment. "Son," he said, extending a weathered hand, "I'm Colonel Ray Hutchins, retired. Live about 10 miles south. Saw the news about your HOA troubles." Behind him stood 6 more veterans, ranging from Korea to Afghanistan, all looking like they'd found their new favorite hobby. "We hear you're having some difficulties with civilian appreciation for military vehicle ownership rights," Colonel Hutchins continued, his smile widening. "Thought you might appreciate some moral support." What followed was the most surreal planning session of my life. 7 military veterans strategizing the optimal deployment of a Sherman tank for maximum legal impact and community education. Colonel Hutchins had actually commanded Shermans during his second tour in Vietnam. Beautiful machines, he said, studying Tommy Morrison's photos with professional appreciation. 30 tons of diplomatic persuasion. The tactical advice was priceless. Position Bertha, where she'd be visible from the main street but technically on private property. Ensure clear emergency vehicle access. Document everything with multiple camera angles. And most importantly, let them make the first move. Never give them legitimate grounds for complaint. By Friday, our veteran support network had grown to 15 families, all offering everything from legal research to protest logistics. Mrs. Cecilia had organized a neighborhood barbecue for Saturday, tank arrival celebration, complete with red, white, and blue decorations. The most beautiful twist came Friday evening when Brenda, apparently unaware that her HOA presidency had been terminated, attempted to file criminal charges against me for planning terrorist activities with military equipment. The police desk sergeant, a former Marine named Rodriguez, no relation, listened to her complaint with professional courtesy before explaining that private ownership of demilitarized military vehicles was completely legal, and that filing false police reports was actually a crime. Brenda's response, screaming about Mexican conspiracies at a Hispanic police officer, earned her a formal warning about harassment and a suggestion that she might want to consult an attorney about her legal exposure. Saturday morning, as I watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold while sipping coffee on my front porch, everything was in position. Federal investigators would begin their audit Monday. Channel 7 was scheduled to cover Bertha's arrival live, and Brenda had successfully alienated everyone from the police department to her own HOA board. Sometimes the best military strategy is simply maintaining discipline while your enemy destroys themselves. Bertha would arrive in 72 hours, but Brenda had already lost the war. Sunday afternoon brought Brenda's final desperate gambit, and it was a masterpiece of suburban corruption that would have impressed a Chicago alderman. I was in my garage organizing tools when Sophia burst through the door, her eyes wide with the kind of excitement that usually preceded either very good or very bad news. "Dad, you need to see this," she said, holding up her phone with a video playing. Mrs. Cecilia recorded it from her kitchen window. The footage showed Brenda in my front yard at dawn, dressed in black yoga pants and a dark hoodie like some middle-aged suburban ninja, methodically placing what looked like small metal objects under my truck's tires. "Are those?" I started to ask. "Roofing nails," Sophia confirmed. She put them under all 4 tires, then called Murphy's Towing, claiming your truck was leaking oil all over the street. The plan was diabolically simple. Create evidence of an environmental violation, get my truck towed for hazardous fluid contamination, then use the towing as justification to prevent any additional dangerous vehicles from entering the property. But Brenda had made one critical error in her sabotage scheme. She'd underestimated Mrs. Cecilia's insomnia and security camera obsession. By noon, I had crystal clear footage of Brenda committing criminal mischief, filing false reports, and attempting to manufacture evidence for fraud. The timestamps showed her placing nails at 5:47 a.m., then calling the towing company at 6:15 a.m., claiming she'd noticed hazardous leaking during her morning community inspection. The tow truck driver, the same tired guy who'd hauled my truck twice before, took one look at the obviously planted nails and called his supervisor. 20 minutes later, he was explaining to very interested police officers that the oil leak appeared to be motor oil poured from a bottle, and the road hazard nails were clearly placed after the vehicle was parked. When Officers Martinez and Johnson knocked on Brenda's door to discuss the discrepancies in her report, she made her final catastrophic mistake. She tried to bribe them. "Officers, I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding," she said, according to their body camera footage that would later become YouTube gold. "I'm prepared to make a substantial donation to your police benevolent fund to show my appreciation for your service." The amount she offered, $5,000 in cash, transformed misdemeanor false reporting into felony bribery of police officers. But even as handcuffs clicked around Brenda's wrists for the second time in a week, she wasn't finished. Her phone call from the county jail went straight to the mayor's office, where she apparently offered $20,000 in community improvement donations if he would intervene to stop the military vehicle situation. That conversation, recorded per standard municipal policy, added federal corruption charges to her growing collection of felonies. By Sunday evening, my phone was ringing off the hook with reporters, legal analysts, and what appeared to be half the internet asking for interviews about the suburban tank war that had generated more criminal charges than a mafia trial. The story had everything modern media loved: racial discrimination, military veterans, federal fraud, suburban entitlement, and a woman so committed to HOA tyranny that she'd apparently forgotten bribery was illegal. Monday morning brought the news that transformed everything from local entertainment to national outrage. Brenda's real estate license had been suspended pending investigation, and her brokerage was facing federal scrutiny for potential systematic housing discrimination practices. The investigation revealed that Brenda's company had been steering minority buyers away from certain developments for years, using coded language about community fit and cultural compatibility. The same discrimination she'd been practicing in Willowbrook Heights, she'd been implementing professionally across 3 counties. Tuesday delivered the final piece of Brenda's self-destruction. Her insurance company announced they were voiding all her policies due to criminal activity exclusions. Her homeowner's insurance, professional liability coverage, and legal defense fund all canceled simultaneously. The woman who'd spent months trying to destroy my financial security had somehow managed to eliminate her own in less than a week. Wednesday evening, as I sat on my front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Jake Morrison called with news that made me smile wider than I had in months. "Marcus, you're not going to believe this," he said, barely containing his laughter. "Brenda's lawyer just contacted us about a settlement discussion." "Settlement for what? We haven't even filed the big lawsuit yet." That's the beautiful part. She wants to settle everything: the discrimination, the federal fraud, the criminal charges, before your tank arrives tomorrow. She's offering complete withdrawal from the neighborhood, full financial restitution, and a public apology. I listened to evening birds singing in my oak tree while considering the irony. Brenda had fought so hard to remove me from a neighborhood where I legally belonged that she'd ended up removing herself instead. "What's she offering?" I asked. "Everything, Marcus. Absolutely everything." Tomorrow, Bertha would roll into Willowbrook Heights as a victory parade rather than a battle declaration. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply watching your enemies defeat themselves while you document the process. Thursday morning at 9 a.m. sharp, 30 tons of American-made justice rolled down Maple Street like a parade float designed by the Pentagon. The sound hit you first, that deep diesel rumble that makes your chest vibrate and your neighbors peek through curtains. Then came the visual that would be replayed on news channels for weeks: a pristine 1943 Sherman tank, olive drab paint gleaming in the Colorado sunshine, white star prominent on the turret, rolling through suburban America like history coming home. I stood in my driveway wearing my dress uniform for the first time since retirement, watching 200 neighbors line the street with phones raised like digital salutes. Kids on bicycles followed the convoy at a safe distance while their parents live-streamed what Channel 7 was calling the most unusual property rights demonstration in Colorado history. Bertha's arrival was precision choreography. Tommy Morrison's escort vehicle led the way, followed by the heavy haul trailer carrying my new temporary roommate, then a convoy of 15 vehicles driven by veterans from 3 counties who'd decided this was their fight too. The timing was poetry. Exactly as the tank reached my driveway, 3 news vans pulled up, followed by police cars with officers who looked like they were trying very hard not to grin. Colonel Hutchins stepped out of his truck wearing full dress uniform, ribbons and all. "Permission to commence neighborhood education operations, sir?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Permission granted, Colonel. Let's show these folks what appropriate vehicle parking looks like." The crowd that gathered was bigger than any HOA meeting in Willowbrook Heights history. Neighbors I'd never met, veterans from across the state, reporters with cameras, and children whose eyes went wide at seeing an actual tank in suburbia. And then, like the climax of a perfectly scripted drama, Brenda arrived. She pulled up in her white Lexus, apparently released on bail that morning, took one look at 30 tons of tank positioned exactly on my property line, and lost whatever remained of her composure. "This is illegal!" she screamed, marching across my lawn in yesterday's designer clothes and what appeared to be severe emotional distress. "You can't park military weapons in a residential neighborhood." Officer Martinez, the same cop she'd tried to bribe 3 days earlier, stepped forward with his body camera recording. "Ma'am, the vehicle has all proper permits and is legally parked on private property." "I don't care about permits," Brenda shrieked, her voice reaching frequencies that made dogs across the neighborhood howl in sympathy. This is harassment. This is terrorism. This is a legal recreational vehicle, I interrupted, walking over with my registration paperwork and Tommy Morrison's rental agreement. Same as an RV, just with more historical significance. The crowd fell silent except for the tank's diesel engine purring like a 30-ton cat. News cameras zoomed in as Brenda's face cycled through shades of red that would have impressed a lobster. "You did this to destroy our community," she accused, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "You and your people are trying to turn this neighborhood into some kind of military compound." That's when that's Cecilia, all 5 feet of her, stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd survived actual war zones. "Mrs. Harwick," she said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd, "Marcus is the only one here who's never tried to destroy anything. You're the one who's been terrorizing families, filing false reports, and stealing federal money for years." The murmur of agreement from the crowd sounded like distant thunder. Phones continued recording as Brenda's public meltdown reached nuclear levels. "I built this community," she screamed. "I protected property values. I maintained standards. And now you're all supporting this. She gestured wildly at me, searching for words that wouldn't sound explicitly racist on camera. That's when Jake Morrison stepped out of the crowd, looking every inch the federal prosecutor he'd become. "Mrs. Harwick, perhaps this isn't the best venue for public statements, considering your pending criminal charges." The mention of federal crime seemed to snap something in Brenda's brain. She turned to the news cameras with the desperate energy of someone whose world was collapsing in real time. "This is America," she declared, as if that explained everything. "I have rights. I have property values to protect. I shouldn't have to live next to people who don't understand our way of life." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the tank's engine seemed to idle more quietly, as if mechanical sympathy was possible. Channel 7's reporter, a young woman who'd probably never seen racism this naked outside of history documentaries, stepped forward with her microphone. "Mrs. Harwick, are you saying that Mr. Rodriguez, a 23-year Army veteran, doesn't belong in this neighborhood because of his ethnicity?" Brenda's response would be replayed millions of times across social media. "I'm saying some people just don't fit with our community standards, and if you can't see the obvious difference, then you're part of the problem too." The crowd's collective gasp was audible. Officers Martinez and Johnson exchanged looks that suggested Brenda had just provided excellent evidence for her upcoming federal discrimination trial. Colonel Hutchins stepped forward, his dress uniform creating a stark contrast to Brenda's disheveled appearance. "Ma'am," he said with military precision, "that tank represents American values, freedom, justice, and the right of every citizen to live peacefully without harassment." He paused, letting that sink in. "Maybe you should consider which one of you actually belongs in this neighborhood." The applause started slowly, then built to a roar that echoed off houses and probably registered on seismographs. 6 months later, Willowbrook Heights looked like a completely different neighborhood. Not because anything physical had changed, but because everything social had transformed. Brenda Harwick pled guilty to federal fraud, state bribery charges, and civil rights violations in a plea deal that sent her to federal prison for 18 months. Her real estate company paid $2.8 million in restitution to the federal government and an additional $500,000 in civil rights settlements to the families she'd targeted. The HOA board, now led by Janet Walsh with David Johnson as vice president, implemented the most progressive anti-discrimination policies in Colorado. The new bylaws included mandatory bias training, transparent enforcement reporting, and a community ombudsman program that I helped design using military conflict resolution principles. My house, along with 29 others, was officially designated affordable housing under federal oversight. The program now serves teachers, nurses, veterans, and working families who make our community stronger rather than more expensive. Property values actually increased once word spread about our most welcoming neighborhood in the county reputation. The federal investigation expanded beyond our development, ultimately exposing a network of discriminatory practices across 3 counties that resulted in 17 additional prosecutions. Brenda's case became a textbook example in law schools teaching housing discrimination law. But the real transformation happened in the relationships between neighbors who'd never spoken before that day. Mrs. Cecilia started hosting weekly coffee mornings where residents share cultural traditions and neighborhood concerns. The Patel family's Diwali celebration became a community-wide festival. Maria Santos organized a neighborhood medical response team drawing on residents' healthcare experience. Sophia, now a high school senior, wrote her college application essay about watching her father stand up to systematic racism using legal strategy, community organizing, and appropriate visual aids. She was accepted to West Point with a full scholarship. Apparently, admissions officers appreciate applicants whose families demonstrate practical civic engagement. Carmen established the Willowbrook Veterans Support Network, providing healthcare navigation services for military families across the county. Her program has helped over 200 veterans access benefits and services they'd struggled to find on their own. The tank, meanwhile, became a neighborhood legend. Bertha made 3 more appearances: Memorial Day, Veterans Day, and the first anniversary of what residents now call Tank Day. Tommy Morrison eventually donated her permanently to the local VFW post, where she serves as the centerpiece for their military history education program. Channel 7's original news story won a regional Emmy for outstanding coverage of community issues. The reporter, Jessica Martinez, used the story as her breakthrough piece for a national network position, where she now covers civil rights issues across the American West. Most satisfying of all was the community project we launched with the settlement money. The Willowbrook Fairness Fund provides legal assistance to families facing HOA discrimination anywhere in Colorado. We've helped 43 families fight bogus violations, prevented 6 illegal evictions, and forced 12 other developments to comply with federal housing requirements. The fund also sponsors an annual scholarship for military veterans pursuing engineering degrees. This year's recipient was a young woman from Afghanistan whose family was targeted by their HOA until our legal team got involved. Last month, I received a call from a veteran in Florida whose condo association was harassing disabled residents. "I heard about your tank solution," he said. "Any advice for dealing with HOA tyrants who think wheelchairs are eyesores?" I shared our legal strategy, connected him with Jake Morrison's network, and mentioned that Tommy Morrison had recently acquired a restored patent tank that was available for educational demonstrations. Some battles you fight once, others you fight until the system changes. Standing on my front porch this morning, coffee in hand, listening to mockingbirds sing in the oak tree that still shades my driveway, I can see kids riding bicycles past Carl Henderson's white pickup and my dark blue Ridgeline, both parked exactly where they belong. The American flag flies prominently in my front yard, not as a statement of defiance, but as a reminder that this country's promise of equality and justice sometimes requires citizens willing to fight for it with whatever tools necessary, whether that's federal law, community organizing, or 30 tons of educational steel. What's the worst thing your HOA has ever done to you? Drop it in the comments below, and don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button, because justice isn't just served. It's delivered with American precision and appropriate firepower. And if you think a tank made an impression, wait until you hear about the Navy SEAL who taught his HOA about maritime property law using a destroyer escort.